In Aliens Fireteam Elite, the Colonial Marines begin a search for Palace Station's Weyland-Yutani scientist Dr. Timothy Hoenikker, who had sought refuge in the orbital refinery Katanga. Communications opened up with the doctor, who was holed up in the over-monitoring Nexus section of Deck 41 Bashi Tower. Hoenikker spoke briefly of the outbreak on Palace Station and warned the Marines of a large, gray-striped xenomorph still on the loose of the refinery, one he called Monica. "There's one Xeno that I keep seeing, I think," he told them. "That one knows me, followed me. They made it. In the lab on LV-895, it came up here with us. The one it came out of. Her name was Monica." Who or what is this gray-striped xenomorph that had Dr. Hoenikker so unnerved? Monica's origins can be found in the Weston Oaks novel Aliens Infiltrator, the official prequel to Fireteam Elite. The story of Infiltrator follows Dr. Hoenikker from his first day on Palace Station, working with the Weyland-Yutani experiments, to his escape from the station onto the Katanga. It came as a shock to Hoenikker that he would be working with living test subjects, and would be specifically involved with experiments on the Xenomorph XX-121. The life cycle of Ovomorph to facehugger to parasite through a human host was known, and Palace Station had a total of 12 human hosts involved with these experiments. Various ages and ethnicities. They were volunteers who had made one deal or another with the company. Some were prisoners with life sentences who wanted to die early. Others with terminal illnesses. These human test subjects remained anonymous, simply assigned a number each, and the scientists agreed to be as objective as they could. This proved difficult for Hoenikker when he observed Test Subject 3 from the novel. She looked like an older version of Hoenikker's steady girlfriend during the first 2 years of university. Her name had been Monica Enright. She was blonde, introspective, but eager to please as if it had been drilled into her by her parents and she couldn't turn it off. In the end, that had been the problem. No matter how Hoenikker messed up his life or grades or his relationship, she forgave him and wanted nothing more than to make him happy, in order to be happy. It had been toxic for him, and just as toxic for her, he'd convinced himself. In the end, he'd walked out. He'd always wondered if he'd done the right thing. Was it her fault that she loved so unconditionally? Was it something that he deserved? It certainly didn't make her a bad person. The opposite had been true. She was a great person. He could still see her face as he left, not understanding, unable to fathom why he was leaving when she would do anything for him. Perhaps that was the problem. A relationship couldn't exist without some degree of conflict. He needed her to be angry. He needed balance. Still, he wondered what his life would have been like had he stayed with her, married her. At first, Hoenikker was convinced that Test Subject 3 just bore a striking resemblance to Monica, that perhaps even that was exaggerated in his own mind. It had been a long time. He still had his regrets. The subject simply reminded him of his old flame and the mistakes of his past. But in observing more closely, he noticed details that were unique to Monica Enright, certain mannerisms, a very specific way of cocking her head. It was her. There was absolutely no doubt about it. Hoenikker was in shock at this revelation, and severely conflicted. He couldn't possibly move forward with the experiments now. But even if he resigned in protest, Monica would still become a host to the parasite and still die. Maybe he could save her somehow. Maybe it was fate that brought them together again. 20 years later. He could make up for his mistakes and set things right. From the novel. The next morning was set for the experiments to begin. According to the plan, they'd remove the lower half of the cryogenic travel cases so the ovomorphs would awaken. Then, sometime between 10 and 30 minutes later, each ovomorph would detect the presence of another biological organism and would deliver the facehugger, who would then find the organism. Pitting human against facehugger, there would be no winning for the human. It wasn't even a challenge, especially since there was nowhere for the humans to run. Dr. Cruz insisted that all doctors be present to acknowledge the sacrifices the test subjects were making. Hoenikker would be there, but first he had something to do. At 4 a.m, after a sleepless night, he entered the lab. The lights were in maintenance mode and cast the room in a barely lit gloom. He approached the workstation in front of containment room 3 and sat before it. The chamber was dark except for the blinking lights on the cryogenic travel cases. He dialed up the vid display and toggled infrared, noticing immediately that Test Subject 3 was sitting up on the rear ledge and facing in his direction. So, he wouldn't have to wake her up after all. He toggled the lights up to 50% to reveal that she was staring back at him. He turned on the intercom. His mouth felt dry. He'd planned a speech. He practiced in the mirror. All that came out was, "It's you, isn't it?" She wore her blonde hair short. The wide space between her eyes accentuated her features. High cheekbones made it seem as if she was always on the verge of a smile. Her green eyes mesmerized as they caught the light and changed. She nodded. He bit his lip. "I knew it from the moment I saw you." She cocked her head and shrugged. "Will you talk to me?" She stared at him for what seemed like forever, but was only 30 seconds. "What is it you want me to say?" she replied, her voice as soft as he remembered. "That you broke my heart? That you walked out on me? On us?" 20 years and 100 parsecs flashed through him. He remembered them holding hands in college, going to class, concerts, even the library terminals. Her kiss tasted sweet because she was always sucking on one candy or another. Even the smell of her clothes burst through him in a timeless hurricane of scent memory. She'd make him dinner most nights, nothing special. They were students. But just the effort of someone making him instant noodles or instant rice was a convenience he'd taken for granted. And her smile. Now, looking at her, he could see her without a smile, yet she was still beautiful, and he'd left it all behind. Had he thought that it would be too much, that he'd end up behind a desk doing something corporate and meaningless? Had he been afraid that his dream of becoming a scientist would be lost because he'd have to settle with her as soon as she became pregnant or decided she was done with school? Or was it just that he'd been a selfish prick who didn't understand that he'd had it good? "That was 20 years ago," he said. She regarded him with side eyes. Then she stared at the egg resting in the cradle of the cryo travel case. She didn't seem to be afraid of it. "Ever wonder if your life would be different if it wasn't for a single decision?" she asked. Had his leaving started her on a path from which she couldn't return? "Me leaving?" he asked. She sneered. Then she stood and walked to the glass, putting her hands on it. "I'm over that. I mean the decision I made when I decided to kill the man I was with. For his money." Hoenikker, who had been leaning forward, sat back hard. He'd hoped she'd been the one with the terminal illness, but she was the murderer. "What? You didn't know?" she asked, adding a little vinegar to her sugar. "I've killed many a man. Turns out I like it." All he could do was shake his head. "Turns out I've always been this way. My desire to please was nothing more than an emotional placeholder. When I pleased people, they would return the gesture and would fulfill something in me. But what I found is that a man begging for his life is even more of an emotional rush. The idea of pleasing them because I might allow them to live filled me with a certain ecstasy." He couldn't parse her words with the memory of her. They didn't match. It was as if his old girlfriend had had her mind wiped clean and replaced. She couldn't have been like this when they were together. "What are you saying?" he asked. "I can see you there, feeling sorry for me and wondering what would have happened had you not walked out. I'm not exactly sure. You might have become my first victim, or you might have kept me from killing. Although, I have to tell you, Timothy, murdering is such a fucking rush." Hoenikker flicked off the intercom. This wasn't his memory. This was something else entirely. Sure, it was Monica, but it was as if something had invaded her body, changed her. Of the test subjects, Monica Enright was one of the prisoners facing a life sentence. Hoenikker confided in Dr. Cruz for further information. He confirmed the murder and sentencing and revealed that she was bound for a terraforming prison work detail, dangerous and grueling work. "Nothing I'd wish on my worst enemy," Cruz added. This was her way of escaping that fate. Hoenikker convinced himself at this point that there was not much he could do for Monica, and that he had made her decision. He took comfort in the fact that ultimately their research would help humanity on a larger scale. The experiments proceeded as intended, and Hoenikker was indeed present. Prior to contact, the human test subjects were injected with a radiated pathogen, as were the ovomorphs. The process would either positively or adversely affect the xenomorphology. Each of the test subjects had been fitted with transmitters that provided live health data. Hoenikker made sure these were streaming as his vid display recorded the results. All 12 were successfully implanted with the xenomorph embryo, and had successfully birthed the nymph stage of the xenomorph. Hoenikker had found himself obsessively watching the recordings of Monica from the novel. When the egg had released the facehugger, she'd stood her ground. Balled fists down at her sides, straight-backed, she'd only flinched a little as the thing attached itself to her, wrapping its tail 3 times around her slender neck. Instead of falling, she'd backed toward the ledge near the back of the containment room and sat, resting her fists in her lap as she leaned on it for balance. Her stoicism was what kept him coming back to the video. That she seemed so accepting of her situation demonstrated how much she'd changed in the intervening years. He'd rewatched the first half of the video no less than 20 times, trying to see if there had been any other reaction he could discern, but as often as he'd watched, he couldn't see any. The second half of the video was hardest to watch. She hadn't fared as well in the last 3 minutes and 47 seconds. The facehugger had been long gone, and her serotonin levels were maxed when the thing inside of her began to move. She felt it and tore her shirt away. Her breasts hung heavy, nipples pointed down, no longer in the bloom of youth. He'd known and mapped them when they were younger, but they weren't the focus of his attention. Instead, he stared at the lump that continually pressed against the inside of her chest and abdomen. Tentative at first, the chestburster wasn't ready for the full Monty. Instead, it pressed its face and jaws against the inside of her skin, revealing itself even before it broke free. Each time it moved within, she'd shriek, then force herself to stand still. It was as if her single fuck you to the universe was to try not to panic, instead provide as much of herself to witness as possible. For the sake of science? It had to be for the sake of science, because no one could possibly get off on the destruction of a human being in such a way. No one he'd ever want to know anyway. The irradiated pathogen, injected into the ovomorphs and test subjects, had interesting and varying results as the xenomorph specimens grew into their adult forms. Test Subject 5, for example, had grown an extra set of limbs. Test Subject 7, explored previously on this channel, appeared as a stronger, translucent, albino xenomorph. And indeed, Test Subject 3, Monica, had new developments, as described in Infiltrator. Although she'd become a drone like the previous two, her skin was dark and leathery with an odd striping, the texture evident from many meters away. The overall effect was different. This xenomorph seemed more malevolent. As Dr. Hoenikker mentioned in a briefing from Aliens Fireteam Elite, the scientists at Palace Station couldn't figure out why mutations weren't 100% consistent. Biologist Etienne Lacroix theorized that the pathogen could blend the host DNA with that of viruses or bacteria in their body. Chemical engineer Melbourne Matthews thought its ability to enter cells was blocked or inhibited by polysaccharides, cell walls, like in plant or fungal life. In Infiltrator, Dr. Aaron Cash, the team lead of the project, had particular concerns about Test Subject 7, the albino. She believed it to be some kind of super drone, capable of leading others in the absence of a queen. This theory had been proven some time later, after Seven seemed to organize an escape with the other test subjects, including Monica. Things went awry very quickly. The scientists and entire security staff of Palace Station had been killed by the escaped xenomorphs. Eventually, only Hoenikker and Cash were left alive. They made it to the shuttle bay of the station, successfully orchestrating an escape aboard the shuttle, the San Lorenzo, to the nearby Katanga refinery. Unfortunately, they were not alone. From the novel. Just as the docking sequence commenced, the shuttle rocked as if with a blow. Hoenikker looked toward the place they'd been hit and saw that it was the broad front window. Instead of space, which is what he expected to see, he saw a fully adult xenomorph with light stripes along its arms and torso. Monica. How had she... Even as he watched, she brought her clawed hands up and pounded a windshield already weakened by her acid. She chewed at the glass and drooled on even more of it as she pounded. "Watch my back," he said to Cash. "I'm going to send a distress signal." He found the communications array and looked for a way to send a signal. It took a few moments, then he found it. A switch underneath a red protective cover that said emergency. He lifted the cover and pressed the switch. The screen in front of him came to life with several choices. 1. Evacuate ship. 2. Vacuum ship. 3. Send emergency message. 4. Destruct sequence. He selected number 3. Waited. When he saw what looked like a microphone flashing green, he spoke. "Anybody out there? Anybody? This is Dr. Timothy Hoenikker from Palace Station. Everyone is dead. Please come. I am on the San Lorenzo. We have an infiltration of..." He noted that the microphone was no longer flashing, and it switched to red. The message would have to be enough. He turned and said, "Okay, let's find us a place to..." Monica had Cash, a claw over her mouth. The xenomorph had made it on board. He reached down and discovered that he was weaponless. He'd left the pulse rifle in the shuttle, but that had been emptied. Cash squirmed free, fired several times at her captor, then screamed as the acid washed against her, cascading her chest. "Run, Tim!" she gurgle-screamed. "Save yourself!" The Monica Xeno hissed as it twitched toward him. Acid-laced saliva slapped Cash's face, and she screamed. Then it cocked its head, just as Monica had done, what seemed like eons ago. As the novel ends, Hoenikker makes it through the Katanga, running frantically, finally finding an area he believes to be safe and sealing himself in. He begins to hear clawing at the door. He knows it is Monica, waiting, toying with him, ready to kill. The events of Alien's Fireteam Elite take place not too long after. The game begins with the Colonial Marines responding to Hoenikker's distress signal and boarding the Katanga. In the first campaign, Priority 1, Mission 2, Rescue, the Fireteam encounters Monica. Corporal Ibrahim Savain and the Endeavor's synthetic Esther prepared a post-encounter debrief with their findings. General notes. Experiment created at Weyland-Yutani's Palace Station facility. Ovomorph injected with irradiated engineer pathogen. Facehugger allowed to parasitize Monica Enright, test subject 3. Chestburster allowed to mature into adult form drone. Positive, one of a kind. Negative, unpredictable genetic enhancements. Reconnaissance notes. Monica exhibited atypical long-term stalking behavior, pursuing Dr. Hoenikker through Katanga for 2 weeks. Offensive abilities. Claws and inner jaw, enhanced speed. Defensive abilities. Enhanced agility and resilience. Knowledge of Katanga's HVAC ducts. Size. Height over 1.8 meters. Never observed standing straight. Monica appears twice in this mission. First, just outside the refrigerant distribution manifold of Bashi Tower's Deck 41. Hoenikker, while observing the mission, panics at the sight of her. He urges the fire team to get out of there. Only a certain amount of combat takes place against Monica until she disappears into the docks. She appears the final time just outside Hoenikker's hiding place at the very end of the mission. Monica enters in the midst of a xenomorph attack as the doors are unlocking. When the mission is successfully completed, Monica is killed by the fire team, and Hoenikker is rescued. He breathes a sigh of relief. It's over. God. Finally. The existence of a variant such as Monica brings up an interesting possibility when it comes to the alien life cycle. We know a xenomorph can inherit certain physical traits of a host, such as a bipedal creature becoming a bipedal xenomorph. We know a xenomorph can inherit certain physical traits of a host, such as a quadrupedal creature becoming a quadrupedal xenomorph. But could a xenomorph take on personality traits of the host? Could a psychotic killer, such as Monica Enright, be the basis for an especially malevolent alien drone, as we see here? Could little quirks and physical habits, such as the head cocking, be inherited as well? And how much of this development can be attributed to the irradiated pathogen involved with this particular test subject? What do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts on the matter, so please leave a comment below. As always, I'd like to thank you very much for watching today. Be sure to leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and be sure to subscribe to the channel to keep up with the latest from Alien Theory. My very special thanks goes out to Nicholas Butta, our Weyland-Yutani executive, and Gregory Ford, the Patreon Hive Praetorian. A very, very special thanks, as always, goes out to Lady Anne in the Ellen Ripley Tier of Excellence. If you'd like to join the Hive and support the channel, check out my Patreon page for further information. In the meantime, you can follow me on social media. Follow @alien_theory on X, formerly Twitter. Follow @AlienTheoryYT on Facebook and Instagram for more. And until next time, this is Alien Theory, signing off.